Okay, so next up, we're going to have Wilson Silva and Lee Hins from Approve It talking about leveraging an FCC radio approval in Latin America until you cannot, which I've actually personally lived through. So I'm interested to hear what they say. Come on up, guys.
I'm Lee Hintz, and we have Wilson, and I'm going to be talking about how you can use FCC approvals to gain approval in Latin America, as there's a lot of parallels between the two of them. I'm sure many of you, as manufacturers, have already gone through the FCC approval and can see how daunting that can be, either through SDoc or certification. So today, we're going to be talking about why approvals are necessary, the 3 different types of FCC approvals and different kind of categories. Those FCC approvals can be compartmentalized into Latin American approvals. And then lastly, we'll go into a deep dive on what the approval process is for Brazil. So assume you're a manufacturer, you have a cool new device and you want to get it out on the market. You've done the FCC approval and you want to expand that to other Latin American countries. So what do you do next? So you have a couple options, and one of those options you may assume, since you already have the FCC approval done, you've done the radio testing, you've done the emissions, is that, hey, why not? It should just be able to go and operate in Latin American countries or any other country around the world. That's not the case. Each of these countries have their own regulatory bodies that need to be registered your equipment with. And so it's very important that it plays well with all the other equipment, because spectrum, as you know, is very, very special, and so everyone has to play along with that. Some of the other options would be to reach out to the regulatory bodies of the appropriate Latin American countries, or talk to your local friendly test house that you may have used for the FCC, as they may be able to provide more guidance and documentation, or regulatory compliance companies as well, as we have a lot of information and experience firsthand in doing the regulatory approvals for many of the countries around the world. So the reasons why you'd want to get the approvals are because you can be imposed fines if your equipment comes into the country and then you start operating it, and then citizens can complain about it or others can complain about it, and then the regulatory body of that country comes to you and says, hey, we need to audit your equipment, like we need your test reports and everything to make sure that everything is kosher. Another reason is in this situation, such as LoRaWAN, where you have a radio and you have a customer base that is operating on that radio, the regulatory bodies can ask you to stop operating, and then your customer base doesn't have a network to operate on. Other things is bringing your equipment into the country as well. If it's not pre-approved for the country, it can be stopped through customs, and then you would have issues there. So next, let's look at the different types of radio approvals. One is the exemption, SDoc, and certification. The exemption doesn't really apply in this situation because we do have radios, but for equipment that doesn't have radios, that are just unintentional radio emissions, so they only have the emissions from the PCB and the host device, those can be exempt in certain situations. The SDoc approval is mainly for the situations where you're integrating a radio module into your host equipment. And so this is the best case because it gets you to your market a lot quicker, and there's less effort that you have to do at test houses. Lastly, there's the certification effort that's a lot more complex, because in this situation, you have to test all the different modes that the radio can operate in. And then you also have to test the EMC for your equipment, which, if you have debugging issues for emissions, it may cause you to hold back from getting to market. So next, we go deeper into what the SDoc procedure is. What do we need? What does it take? The SDoc, fortunately, doesn't require you to file with an FCC or a TCB. This just has a responsible party that is accountable in situations that the equipment might be audited, but you also have to make sure that you have all your testing done for the equipment to show that it's been gone through all the testing for the radios, the emissions, mainly for the FCC. You also have the proper identification for your equipment. You have a brand, a model, some kind of way to identify it. And in most cases, you're going to be integrating a radio module into this equipment. And so you need to have identification of which radio module that is. So it must be labeled with contains the certain FCC information. So I have an example here of what an SDoc looks like, what the format is. It can oftentimes be reused. This is pretty much taken from the FCC site. There are other information that you'd also need as well as the statement, particularly for the different classes, Class A or Class B, based on residential and commercial. There's some head nods here, so people are familiar with this. And then last, there's the certification process. This one we have to file with the TCB or the FCC in certain situations where we are creating our radio from scratch, basically. We have hardware, and then we have to program in the different software, and then have that evaluated by the FCC through a test house. So the test house would take it, they'd generate test reports, hopefully everything passes, then you submit that to the FCC. So there is some parallels here for the FCC that we'll get onto for Latin America, but mainly the process for certification effort is get all of your documentation in place, have your test reports completed, then you generate a package, you submit that to the TCB or the FCC, they look at it, review it, make sure that everything's okay. If they have any comments or feedback, you have to address those, and then once everything is good, then you're able to be given a FCC ID, which is then given to you for your particular model of your equipment. The unique thing about the certification as well is that you would need to have an FRN. So that's similar to the responsible party, but your company must register with the FCC in particular. So you're issued an FRN, then after that you can be issued a FCC grantee code, which is either the 3 or 5 digits part of your FCC ID. And lastly, there's some other things that are a lot more technical in matters, such as the block diagram, schematic, BOM, and those can be withheld from being published on the FCC site, because once you do get the certification, it often is available there. So using a confidential request letter, you can have that information withheld from being published. So these are the 20 different countries that we're going to be addressing in this situation. I have also here listed the different LoRa WAN frequencies that are used for these countries. And I'll get more into that later, as there's going to be some supplemental documentation that's used for Latin American countries. So the first category of equipment is going to be more or less voluntary. There is no regulatory body that you have to submit your application to. And for these countries, that's going to be Colombia, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala. And there's certain criteria that has to be met for a few of them. Colombia and El Salvador are unique ones where for the FCC, we will have a test report that goes from 902 megahertz up to 928 megahertz. And then for these Latin American countries, we have to use a subset of that test report. So when you go to these countries, you want to make sure that your LoRaWAN radio is operating in more strict subset of frequencies that's allowed here. Next is more of the countries that the FCC approvals can be used as a basis for homologation. So now that we've gone through the process of the FCC approval, you have your SDoc or you have your certification done, some of the documents can be leveraged in order to apply for Latin American countries. So we have our test reports, which are important, your product literature, which is used for user manual installation guides, the external and internal photos. External photos, you want to have detailed photos that show all 6 faces as well as the label. Internal photos are going to be used because you'll want to know how the products are assembled, as well as information on the RF modules that are inside as well. And so when these products oftentimes get approved, they will review all the information and make sure that everything is aligning as much as possible between all the documents, your test reports, your literature that you provide to the customers, as well as the way the thing appears, your product appears through the external and internal photos. Lastly, there is the MPE evaluation, which is oftentimes used in some of the Latin American countries in the situations that they need to have antenna gain. So they evaluate the product output power through EIRP rating, as well as the conducted output power. So now we have some of the supplemental resources that we need in addition to the general documents from the prior slide that will be used to apply for certification in the Latin American countries. So as I mentioned before, we showed the different frequencies in which the LoRaWAN can be used in each of the countries. So we have a document that's considered a declaration of frequency. So now this allows us, and we as a manufacturer agree to only operate the device in the certain frequencies that's allowed by the regulatory body. Each regulatory body or country will have the different subbands of frequencies. They're not all harmonized. That's why kind of regulatory approvals can be a pain sometimes because not everything's the same. But fortunately, we have some documents that we can create in this situation that would say that we have all the other frequency bands disabled, and these are the only particular ones that will be used in the countries. So then we can leverage those FCC reports still without having to do any retesting. Then the next item is the RF module declaration. As mentioned before, the SDoC is leveraging many of the radio modules. So here in this situation, we have to state that we're leveraging a module that comes from a certain brand, the model itself, and then those test reports that come from that manufacturer of the module can be leveraged for their approval in the respective Latin American countries. Lastly, the parallel here for local representative is your responsible parties, such as in the FCC. In this situation, for Paraguay and Peru, we will need to have an in-country representative that is representing the manufacturer that is submitting for approval in that country. And this is in the situation that either your equipment may be audited, they need to have information on how they can reach the manufacturer if anything, maybe having a complaint against your device that's emitting too much or it's causing interference. So this first section, category of countries is being able to approve for general documents and supplemental resources. So that would grant you these countries: Bolivia, Chile, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Paraguay, Suriname, and Uruguay. And there are some caveats, obviously, that Bolivia would require a user manual in Spanish. Chile has regulations on the EIRP rating, which is different from what the FCC would apply, but another document that would help you to get this stated clearly and show that you're going to be compliant with that EIRP rating can be generated. And then the Paraguay, as mentioned, you need a local rep, and then you need a draft of the Conatel label that needs to be submitted with the other documents that would be needed here. Conatel being the regulatory body for Paraguay. So now, with some more work, such as just applying the FCC logo onto your device label, that would then help grant you approval for the following countries: Honduras, Panama, Peru, and Venezuela. Peru being the other caveat in which we would need to label the origin of the country that the device is manufactured in on the label itself. And then lastly, there is this category in which the device needs to go through the certification process, the FCC certification process, and then that can be leveraged for Belize and Guyana. So SDoC 1 apply, you have to have your end device, the host device overall, needs to have a certification done, and so it would have to say FCC ID that would be generated from you as the manufacturer. There is one other consideration here that we can have for gaining approval in the Latin American countries, and this is nice because this is a modular approval that would be applied to each of the countries listed here, in which you can use the FCC ID of a radio module itself and then apply for approval in the Latin American country. Then you would also be granted approval by virtue to the other host device that all these radio modules are integrated into, as long as they have been approved in that respective country by the regulatory body. Additionally, if your device has many radios in it, each of those radios would also need to be pre-approved and then integrated into your host device before they can be granted access to these countries. So lastly, we have the countries in which the FCC is not recognized in these countries. And these are the countries that will have to have in-country testing done. That would be Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. Fortunately, much of the testing that's done for the FCC can also be applied to Mexico and Argentina. And in this situation, you can redo all the testing in-country, so you've done a lot of the work, the footwork up front when you've gone through the FCC approval process already. Additionally, lots of the documents that you've already generated for the FCC can be applied to these countries as well. The only part that's difficult now is that you do have to do the in-country testing, unfortunately, and this can be time-consuming. So To recap, we've reviewed the different types of approvals for the FCC. We've looked at different categories of the documentation that can be used to apply for Latin American countries. And now I'll hand it over to Wilson, who will take over and discuss more about the Brazilian approval for LoRa WAN devices.
Okay, thank you, Lee. Now, the next slides I have present for Brazil certification and the tests you need for certification from Brazil. The agency regulatory for Brazil, it's Anatel. Anatel is responsibility for create norms, create regulations, and inspect products, homologation products, and everything about the telecommunication from Brazil. Unfortunately, in Brazil, Anatel doesn't have mutual agreement for the other certified bodies in the other countries. Because of this, the Anatel requests the test, local test from Brazil, and need you contract the certified body for tests for regulating and homologation products from Brazil. The most important for regulation norms in Brazil, it's a 715. This is mapped for principles, process about the certification for products, and in complement is a 7280. Fault the zero here, but the correct act is 7280. It's defined for how much times your certificate it's validate and your classificate your products. It's depend for the technology your product use. Act 40083. This is a procedure of certification from Brazil and what type it tapes your need conclusion for homologation of the products. And the 4088, it's a instruction for you mark your product to Anatel ID. The frequency band used from Brazil, LoRa WAN, it's used 900 megahertz and 2.4 gigahertz for use the LoRa WAN devices. And the classification for this type of product is restricted radiation transmitter. And the tests apply for this specific product, it's the RF test, MC test, safety test, and SAR test if your product, it's depend for power level or your product is portable, etc. But I told more about the few slides. The next slides. Okay. The RF test is very similar for FCC tests, part 15. It's most same, and the most important here is a power limit your product need met. It's a 1 watt for product. It's a similar for FCC. So if you test the FCC, your product and your product's approved for FCC, probably your product approved from Brazil. What type the sample do you need for the RF test? The RF test requests the conduct test sample. This conduct test sample needs the solder SEM cable, output the antenna or connect the outputs of antenna, because in Brazil don't consider it gain of antenna for the test, the RF test. And you need the you need the software test for permission, power set level, change the channel, and set the transmitter rates for the product, because your laboratory needs configuration the simple for the test. The AMC test. The AMC test, the Act 1120, it's most similar for CSPR 22 and 23, but have a difference because in Brazil it's a tropical country. Because of this, it's have most incidence for electrostatic discharge. Because of this is a difference for apply the test these equipments. But most important here, the test is depend are powered by your product. If your product powered by power supply, you apply all the tests for MC test, conduct tests, radiate tests, and emission tests. If your product powered by USB or battery, it's reduce the test, and you apply only a radiate test and ESD. Safety test, it's most similar for AMC test. If your product powered by power supply, you apply all tests, it's electroshock and overheating. If your product powered by USB or battery, you apply the protection overheating test. But have a note here, if your product powered by the battery less than 9 volts, not need to apply the safety test because your product don't overheating. This is Anatel understanding for about the battery. SAR test. When I apply SAR test, I apply SAR test if your product is portable or your product it's a close the body of the user. It's 20 centimeters, for example. But the laboratory measures if your power level it's more than 20 millivolts. If less 20 millivolts, don't need to apply SAR test for your product. If your product is a technical user, don't apply tests for SAR test. Okay. General requirements. In Brazil, you can apply family approval? Yes, you can. But your product needs the same RF model, and I need this similar letter and photos for all products for comparates if your product is similar or not. In Brazil, needs the representative because the representative and manufacturer owner for technology, it's owner for the Anatel ID. If you change the local representative or manufacturer, you need to emission a new certificate for Anatel. Renew, it's mandatory? Yes. For this type of product, if your product operates on LoRa, your certificate, it's validated for 2 years. After 2 years, you need to renew your certificates for continue sell products from Brazil. Documents necessary for certification in Brazil. User manual, technical specification, photos, internal and external photos, schematics, ISO, test instruction, Brazilian test reports, less than 2 years old. If you have the test from Brazil, but not apply the certificate this moment, you have 2 years for complete the certification from Brazil. This is a phase of the certification conformity. The certificate of conformity is issued by a certificate body when you complete your test and send by the documents and the documents is okay. The certificate body issues this document. These documents, their name of representative, their manufacturer address, name, and factory unit, and basically is a summary of characteristics about your process. Here you find the data of test reports, the characteristics of measuring the test, and the other important information about your product. When you submission all documents for Anatel have 2 weeks for analyze all documents, test reports, and certificates. And if you all done, it's okay, Anatel issue this certificate of conformity homologation. Here you'll find the homologation number, local representative, manufacturer, and a summary characteristics about your products. But your validate your certificate, you only find the COC, Certificate of Conformity. This COH doesn't have a validate. It's suspended when your COC expires. So, Here's, for example, you can market your product about the Anatel. Anatel permission, you put in your product Anatel ID and the number, or electronic a label for Anatel, mark, and QR codes if you prefer. Renew. Renew, you need the safety test. If you apply the safety test when you certify the product. If you not apply the safety test when you initial certify, you don't need the test for renew. The documents necessary for renew. Current photos, Anatel don't accept the photos, the certification homologation, no. You need presentation new photos, letter, information if your product change or not. If your product change, need to review all documents and make a confirm it and test again, and the other information is request for certificate body for analyze and define what tests you need. Certificate use is ISO certificate and other documents if necessary. Thank you. This is my contact and Lee, and now open for question.
It would have to be on the device. So you've got to lock it down through software, usually is the case. Software, because most of the modules are reconfigurable through software, and that would be probably the easier way to do it, I would say. When you mentioned LNS, what does that mean?
Like from the network side.
Yeah, no, it would have to be on the device itself. Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of one thing that happens is that some of the countries that are developing, or they look to see what are existing for regulations, and so they may pick and choose from some of the other countries, such as Europe or United States, and that would influence them on what they decide to do. And even like some of the product definitions or short-range devices or RFID, the way those are defined is sometimes taken from some of the other countries, or the country itself will make their own definition for it.
I just wanted to add to your comment. There's industry consortiums like Caneti in Mexico, which if you are part of that, if, you are engaged with them, you're able to influence. Mercosur as well, it's several countries. If LoRa gets engaged with them, then we're able to provide that standardization and work with them. So that would be a good step forward, I think, for the LoRa consortium to go in, and I can help with that.
Actually, it sounds like something the regulatory work group should be involved with, the LoRa Alliance, right? That's a good point. Any other questions? Well, thank you, gentlemen. That was
Thank you.
really good.
Thank you.